Okay.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. All good?
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that has become a bit of a hobby for me. Started out ironically as being asked to give talks in different places about this topic. And so that made me sort of get into it a little bit more and learn a little bit more about it. And so I'm hoping that I'll continue to learn more about it, including from the questions that we get here today. So the focus is, so I have a decent number of slides, but as I will get through as many as you want, stop me anytime for any questions. So I've condensed it from the title that I gave on the calendar invite. I just call it Generative AI in Research, but it's really focusing on generative AI in social science and behavioral science research. It just was too many words to put on that slide out there. So I'm going to start by saying that we are potentially having two paradigm shifts, and I can't decide whether it's a paradigm shift or a paradigm glide. And that's open for debate at this point in my mind. One is in the object of social science scholarship, and then the second is in the conduct of social science scholarship. The talk that I'm going to give today is mostly on the second category, the conduct, but I'm going to go ahead and start by telling a little bit about what I see as the object of social science scholarship. So back in 2009, there were a whole bunch of us. If I look at the number of words of all the co-authors, it's almost as big as the article itself. It was published in 2009, and I was very fortunate to be one of those many co-authors. And we wrote this essay in 2009 in Science with the innocuous title Computational Social Science. And it turns out that had became a landmark moment for this area. Everyone glommed onto it. And the basic argument being made here was that in social science, up until that point, most of us had focused on looking at ways to answer the questions we wanted, either in terms of being able to get survey data or interview data or case study data, or sort of, archival data of one kind or another, or experimental data. But that we were arguing that there was now a moment where we could now have a new source of data that comes into our model, and that is being able to get data at scale, large data at scale, that is available through digital traces. And so this became a way to say, how can we use digital trace data to study essentially human-based social sciences? And I say that because there's a change that's happened in that area. At this point, we were studying, this was the iconic network picture of blogs, of people posting blogs about from the red and the blue colors for the elections. And you could see how we lived in these echo chambers. And this was done by Lada Adamich and became one of the iconic early images of computational social science. 10 years later, we went back again and wrote some more articles. The one on the right was again published in Science. And this time the title was Computational Social Science, Obstacles and Opportunities, where we saw that there was clear benefits, but we also knew that we could be one IRB disaster away from shutting down all of computational social science, just because it had become so big and had created all these potential controversies in terms of privacy, et cetera. And on the left, what we saw was that second shift, that now we were no longer studying simply using computational data or digital trace data to study human behavior, but the behavior that we were studying was itself infused by algorithms. And part of what we were in this was an article that we published in Nature titled Measuring Algorithmically Infused Societies. And the argument was that all of our actions today are now increasingly influenced, not just in the good old days when we looked at social networks, not just influenced by other individuals, but actually by algorithms that were making all these different kinds of recommendations. And it was in all facets of our life. So if you look at it in terms of political processes on the right, a lot of what was happening there was based on recommendations of what news items we were going to consume. We see that in our feed every day. That's all governed by algorithms. If you look at the bottom, it's economics. We get recommendations about what to buy. And if you look on the left, it's about social processes and it's recommendations of who to date, and so on and so forth. So in all of these different facets of our life, algorithms are now playing an incredibly important role. So obviously, the object of study has now changed from being just about studying humans using computational digital trace data, but also now studying the fact that these are part of the infused society. Most of what I'm going to talk about is not about how AI has changed, not studying the effects of AI, but how AI is also changing the way we do our research and the conduct of inquiry. And clearly we are laggards in this area. So if you look at all these Nobel Prize winning efforts that others have done in STEM, they are way ahead of us in ways in which they have used how AI can be used to do research, to unfold proteins, to in a variety of different contexts. And so I'm not going to go into that. What I'm going to talk about is how can AI help with social science and behavioral science research, and where are we on that? And what I'm going to give you as a cliff note, spoiler alert, is I'm going to make an argument that we are at very early stages, and if history is prologue, we're going to use it in ways that are not very imaginative, and as a result will not really increase our productivity or in ways that we would aspire to do so. And I'm going to end by saying, what are the things that we ought to be thinking of beyond what we normally do? So that's sort of a spoiler alert for the overall trace of where I'd like to go with this. Some of you may know about Reid Hoffman. Anyone recognize the name Reid Hoffman, right? LinkedIn co-founder. Reid Hoffman, selling a book recently, came up with this taxonomy where he said, if you look at how people think of technologies, they fall into 4 categories. The 4 categories are the doomers. These are the people who believe that we're in doomsday, it's an existential threat, and everything is going to go, it's going to be just a mess, and so there's no one going to be left to fix it. There's a second category that he calls the gloomers. The gloomers are the people who are gloomy about it, not quite the doomers, they're just gloomy about it. They're the ones who believe that there are big benefits, that people are overselling at this point, and there's going to be near-term certain pain in this area. And it'll hollow out the middle class. A lot of what we see in the media would fall into this category. The third is what we see mostly in Silicon Valley, and that's the Zoomers. These are the people who believe that we can move fast and break things and nothing matters at all. Everything is going to fix itself. If there's problems caused by technology, all we need is more technology to fix the problems that the previous technology caused. And they are also known to make a claim that resonates with me given my other life as a space researcher, which says that now is not the time to worry about overpopulation on Mars. We haven't even gotten to Mars. There'll be time to worry about that later on. Let's not think about that. The last category, which is where I think we put a lot of academics, is in what I would call the bloomer category. So these are the people who are cautiously optimistic, but at the same time, they recognize that we have to see the dual effects that accompany any technology, anticipate them, think about it from that particular context. These are the people who say that while it's important that there are technologists who are proud of inventing the ship, we as social scientists should also be thinking that with the invention of the ship came the invention of the shipwreck. And we have to be thinking about how we deal with that shipwreck in that particular context. Now, while he has used these very nice gloomer, doomer, zoomer, bloomer categorization, people who are in social sciences have for a long time in the history of science talked about the people who fall into the utopian category, people who think it's an unalloyed blessing, the dystopians who think it's an unmitigated curse, the neutrals who seem very sensible at first blush to say, well, it's neither good nor bad, it's what we do with it. And I'm going to make an argument that that is actually extremely naive because in fact, technology is not neutral. It is both having opposite effects at the same time in spite of each other. And our goal, whether it's technology to study how we change education or technology in any of these contexts, repeatedly through history has shown us that that's a much more constructive way of engaging with and prognosticating about how technologies are. As an example, Ithil Solapul, when the telephone was invented, he wrote a book called Forecasting the Telephone. And he went back and read all the forecasts that people had made about what the telephone would be used for. And it's a fascinating read. A lot of the predictions were made by people who were in the press, but the pundits of the time. And what you would basically find would be things like, well, if you have the telephone would essentially, people said it's going to destroy cities because people can go live in the suburbs. It's going to have decentralization. It's going to go everywhere, and the cities are going to be decimated by it. And to some extent, that's true. But what they did not predict was that actually the cities benefited from the telephones, because imagine having high-rise buildings without telephones, stacking all these people on top of one another. So in some ways, the telephone at the same time was doing both centralization and decentralization as an example of it. And we see many, many such examples through it. So my focus, though, is to take that framework to see how we can use it to understand how technology, in this case, AI in particular, can affect scholarly productivity. The first ways in which any of these technologies get used, whether it's the automobile or the telephone, et cetera, is as a substitute. We use it to do things that we were doing previously, hopefully do it cheaper, faster, more economically. If you think about today, when you first heard about Gen AI, what are the things you thought about doing with it? You thought about doing essentially what we've done already, draft an email for us, edit this letter for us, and do it as a pure substitute. And in fact, Ev Rogers, who wrote about the adoption of innovations and was also a Caspis scholar, a Caspis fellow, wrote a book about it, and one of the definitive books on this topic. And he said that any new innovation needs to have these 5 characteristics if they're going to be adopted and diffused widely. Relative advantage. How does this improve what I'm doing right now? Is the effect observable? Is it adaptable to my needs? Is it compatible with the way I did things previously? And is it easy for me to try it without having to incur a lot of cost?
Our audience.
I know I mean, those are my most energetic and enthusiastic audience there.
There are always a lot of turkeys in the audience here.
Okay, that I will not comment. So they clearly, you can see that if you look at ChatGPT, you can see that almost every one of these things meets the requirement, right? It's easy to use, it improves what I'm doing, it's observable, it's easily triable, it's compatible, it's adaptable. So that's the good news. And there are several examples of it. We're not the first. When the automobile was invented, the telephone, video conferencing, the internet, web of the World Wide Web, all of these have had that sort of feature about it that explains in retrospect why they were so successful. And of course, in the dawn of Gen AI, we see the same thing happening. All of these are things that have taken off really quickly. So what's wrong with this? Why don't we just stop at substitution? It seems so seductive to be able to do something with it. It turns out that substitution is not going to, the costs involved in taking a new technology off are not offset by the benefits that are going to be larger than the benefits we might get if we only use the technology as a substitute. And an example of how we can be so wrong about this goes back to what is called the telecommunications transportation trade-off. If you think about when video conferencing and new technologies, communication technologies came into play, people said, we should spend more on technologies because we won't have to travel that much. And so our travel is going to come down and we should invest in technologies. In fact, what they found was what we saw on the right-hand side, that as we spend more on communication technologies, we actually spend more time on transportation because our communication allowed us to think of more things to do together, and we increase the transportation in order to accomplish all of those goals. So we have to be we cannot be naive that these are trade-offs that can work in that particular fashion. Now, what the next thing that we do is we're doing a lot more of it. So it's not just that we are using it as a substitute. The first time we wrote a paper on a word processor, most of you probably wrote it all your lives, but for some of us who weren't on a word processor and began to write it, we thought, it's going to take less time than writing a paper that was only done on a typewriter. Well, it turns out we spent a lot more time because revision was so easy that we kept revising it and revising it all the way till the last minute. And so we continue to do more of it. And that happens a lot in these cases where we take these technologies and we just do a lot more of it. I have a slide, I think, later on about how just within the advent of Gen AI, we are now more than quadruple the number of articles we are publishing and that are being sent to journals and conferences, et cetera. So clearly we're just doing, it becomes easy, so we do a lot more of it. And this happens at scale at the societal level, even the ways in which we are adopting it. It took us 46 years to adopt electricity for a quarter of the US population to adopt electricity. I'm going to jump to the right. It took 30 years for the microwave. It took 7 years for the web. It took 5 years for Facebook. It took 3 years for TikTok. But wait, ChatGPT reached 100 million users in 2 months after its launch. And you could see that if you look at the ways in which it was adopted by 1 in 10 people around the world. And then DeepSeek came along. Remember that? Long time ago, a couple of years ago, last year. And it had, in 48 hours, gotten from 6.2 to 12.4 million users in that period of time. And so you can see that. And then Sora, anyone familiar with Sora? Right. So Sora is this image video generation things, right? And so that's what, and Sora was even faster. In just 6 days after it launched, it reached a clientele that it took ChatGPT 5 days to go. So look at the orders of magnitude we're seeing in terms of all of these enlargements that are happening here. Now, that's great. We can celebrate all of these things that, it's not only we're getting things done fast, but we're doing it at a faster pace, the exponential issue. The problem is, and I had this conversation with someone at the social hour, a couple of folks at the social hour last week, and that is, well, but isn't this good because it's going to uplift all of us? And yes, the good news is it is going to uplift all of us. The bad news is it's going to differentially uplift some people more than others. Again, we know from history, we know from people who have been studying technologies that that the gap can increase, and that's what is the inequity that we should be thinking of in terms of enlargement. Because who are the people who are using it much more? It's the people who are already well privileged, and in our societies, it's the researchers. So this is called as the information gap hypothesis. You can see that it starts by saying there are information have-nots and information haves. Think of this as universities like the one where we are sitting and where we come from typically. And these are the universities in the global south. Everyone might benefit a little bit by using these technologies, but the gap is what is really increasing a lot. And I think one of the things we have to be very cautious about is what are we doing in terms of the future of scholarly research if these gaps increase and the agenda of the haves overwhelmingly dominates the agenda of the have-nots, just because they don't have access to it. Yes.
Supported empirically, if you look.
Yeah.
Yes, this has been shown empirically a lot.
How do you measure that?
So there's a very large body of research in communication theory.
Mhm.
It started it's by a person by the name of Titchener. It's called the information gap hypothesis, the knowledge gap hypothesis. And a lot of the ways in which they would measure something like this is by asking people. In the old days, it was whether people had radio or not. And then they would ask people about how acquainted they were with political issues. They also had measures of education in these contexts. And that's how they would look to see why these were happening. In fact, another former Caspers fellow, Esther Hargitay, has spent a lot of time looking at this in the context of the digital divide. And her work has shown much more recently in terms of digital literacy, that if you give everyone access to a computer, and you think that that's all that is going to matter, she finds that people from lower income communities are less well equipped to use the same computer, the same website to go search for certain pieces of information on the web than others. So is that, yes?
I'm not very familiar with this work, so it might sound like a naive question, but when you're referring to information here, is the assumption that that translates into knowledge production outcomes?
Yeah, so this is as I said, there's one theory called the information gap hypothesis. There's another one that's called the knowledge gap theory. So people that do see the difference between data, information, and knowledge in all of these cases, and some would add to that wisdom as the fourth category in this case. But the one that I'm talking about here was mostly focused on information and how to leverage that information. Esther's work is focusing more on how it is being used for literacy and how you can use it to be able to, I think in one experiment she ran, it means go to the web and try to see the best used car you can buy for under $500. So those are examples of it. So.
Okay, I can see how in the short term, this might be a very strong effect, but I also imagine longer down the road, it actually can lead to convergence.
I see, that's what we want to aspire to, which is part of what I'm saying. At least knowing that this is a natural tendency, are there ways that if we were to anticipate this, we can preempt what you're saying? I think what you're arguing is more aspirational, and it could be that in some areas it is. I hope you're right. I fear, based on what I've read, you're not. So that's where I'll leave that one. So the question that comes up again and again, well, if you're going to do all this investment, why is it that we don't always see the productivity benefits by using any new technology? Lots of studies over the years, whether it was the internet or technology since then, where people find that there's no systematic correlation between investment in technologies and productivity. And one of the people who talked about that a lot was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Robert Solow, who says you can see the computer age everywhere but in the productivity statistics. Fast forward, Eric Brynjolfsson, now you're at Stanford, wrote a book about unpacking the AI productivity paradox. And he had a sentence there that looks strangely similar. These new technologies can be seen everywhere except in the productivity statistics, almost verbatim in this particular case. And the argument is, what then explains why is it that these technologies in many cases don't, but in some cases do? That brings us to the last one, which is the reconfiguration hypothesis. And the reconfiguration says that when we take a new technology like AI and try to plug it into what we are doing research right now and use it as a substitute, or even use it to do more of what we're doing right now, we're not really going to see the benefits that we would hope to see overall because of the costs associated with incorporating these new technologies, and that the real payoffs would come if we can find ways to use it to reconfigure the ways in which we are doing research.
Can you restate that? You said it really quickly. I know probably
Give you an
everybody got it
example.
here except for me.
I'll give you an example and then I'll come back to that. It's a fair question. So when the automobile was invented, when people used it to go from their homes to the local church or to the local market, it was replacing a horse cart. That's one of the reasons why automobiles are still use the horsepower as the metric of energy for that, right? So that's a substitute. If all we did with the automobile was to go back and forth, that's not going to give us big payoffs. Some people said, well, now I can go to the market every day and get fresh food. That's enlargement. You're doing it every day now, right? But it's still not going to give you the real benefits. The real payoffs from the automobile came when we began to think about the interstate highway system, right? So that's a reconfiguration where we had this whole new network of ways of being able to go across the country, even though historically the interstate highway was created as part of the Department of Defense effort to be able to make sure we can mobilize our forces in the Cold War. But the commerce that came out of that was where we really saw the benefits of the automobile and the way it transformed the American economy and certainly many other Western countries and now all over the world in many cases. That's a reconfiguration. If we had stopped short of doing that, the same thing can be applied to the internet. Originally, it was set up as distributed computers. Some of us at academic institutions had a chance to use it for email. The real transformation came when it became a dot-com boom, right? And that whole commercial digital infrastructure got put into place, for better or for worse. The same thing is happening with even on the web. Today, the web is not simply connecting computers, they're connecting every single thing. That's why it's called the Internet of Things, right? Where there are so many devices that are different kinds that are all connected to each other. That's a reconfiguration and rethinking of the fact that today a car is more a computer than an automobile in some respects. So when you look at all of these things, that's what we are trying to look at. And how can we reimagine the conduct of doing research in a way that doesn't stop short of just you being used for substitution or enlargement. And I like Amara's rule, which says we overestimate the effect of technology in the short term and underestimate them in the long term. And I think those are the lessons that I think I feel are important for us to learn. So how is it changing scholarship? Well, I've said this in a few ways, but some of the ways in which it does that is to think of it, as a changing from a scholarship in terms of being a clerk or a colleague or a coach. We've talked about this in other contexts. We use ChatGPT either as a clerk or a colleague or a coach. We talked about this even when Dan was here last week, and it's a phrase sort of that Andrew McAfee has popularized. If I think of the current ways in which some ways of doing research, this is not a universal template for scholarship across the board. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge this, that what I'm talking about doesn't apply only to this template. I'm using this as an example. What I'm going to do in the next few slides is show you basically a lot of different articles that have been published, which are talking about how AI can be used for research design and for experiments. So here, this is an article that says AI can help in the 5 different phases of design: question and literature, hypothesis, wording and instructions, code and documentation, simulation, and code audit. So this is how somebody talked about. This was an article that was published, oh my God, long time ago, 2023. This was an article called "Can ChatGPT be used to generate scientific hypotheses?" And they talk about how it has been used a lot, but while the error rate is high, Gen AI seems to be able to effectively structure vast amounts of scientific knowledge and provide interesting and testable hypotheses. They come up with this phrase, a swarm of hypothesis machines challenged by automated experimentation and adversarial peer review. So this is already hinting at things that are now more novel that we don't know about. But certainly the notion of a swarm of hypothesis machines sounds to me a lot like enlargement. You're just doing a lot more of it because you can do it now. This was an article that came out of the Stanford Social Innovation Review way back when in 2020, and it talked about the case for causal AI and how you can, it has a very catchy opening line: using AI to predict behavior can lead to devastating policy mistakes. Health and development programs must learn to apply causal models that better explain why people behave the way they do to help their most effective leaders for change. This is a very inside sort of conflict between people who come out of a straight AI background and focus on prediction, and those who come out of a more data science background and focus more on explanation and understanding. And so this is the sort of tension that you see within that group, where the data science people are much more focused on causal AI models, and the AI people are like, to heck with that, just as long as we get a prediction, that's all that matters in this case. The hypothesis generation, there are some more articles. This was an article that said they analyzed over 40,000 psychology articles using LLM to extract causal relation pairs. So they essentially create a network where the nodes are various variables and the causal relationships are whether which variable is supposed to influence which other variable. But they're able to do it at a scale that we don't normally think about. And they call that a causal graph in psychology, as a way of also then using that to predict new causal relationships and new hypotheses. This, by the way, had already been used in the medical field before it was used in this particular context out here. And then we talk about, so those are all about hypothesis generation. Then we look at data collection. Can AI serve as a substitute for human subjects in software engineering research? So this is the whole movement that people are talking about, that do we really need to talk to people anymore? Why can't we just talk to the AI agents or the versions of that? I'm looking at you, because you and I have talked about that a few times, right? And this is no longer something that is just a pipe dream. This is in fact becoming a very serious business. Here was a study that was also published not that long ago. It said a large-scale study replicated 154 psychological experiments using GPT-4 as a simulated participant, so using AI-generated participants. The findings indicate that GPT-4 successfully replicated 76% of the main effects and 47% of the interaction effects without actually talking to a human. And in the original suggesting that LLMs can mirror human responses in certain experimental contexts.
I'm confused by that. How do they know that to be true?
So what they will do is, it's actually, I mean, the logic is very simple. What you do is you create simulation virtual agents that have certain attributes of humans. Okay, you can set them up with demographics, you can set them up with personality, you can set them up with networks that mirror what happens in the real world. And then instead of actually bringing people into a lab, you bring all of these people in silico and essentially ask them to run an experiment and decide who they want to talk to. And you want to see how opinions spread, for example.
No, but I understand that, but how do you know that that is similar to the real human?
Because what they did is they compared the results of these experiments with psychological experiments that have been done for the last several decades. Sorry, now I understand. Yes.
How do you know that the output of that isn't based on the actual experiments?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In these particular situations, what they do is they work with what I call sandboxed areas. So they're not going and taking every knowledge that's available on the web. Otherwise, they may go find the original article on polarization.
Right.
So what you do is there are ways in which you create sandbox, which says this is the only. In fact, you have that option in ChatGPT. You may not use it, but you can set ChatGPT option to say uncheck the box that don't go to the web. Only use the information I'm giving you.
Okay.
So that's a way of being able to set it up so that you're literally making sure that whatever emergent dynamics you're observing come from the data you're inputting into it, or the experimental conditions you're providing, not anything that is coming from the web.
But the model, ChatGPT-4 was trained on the web.
Yes.
It was trained on the
It was
web.
trained on the web. It's not going and looking up the study, but it was trained on the web.
So it's
it does
part of the
contain
training.
information.
Yeah, and by the
To me,
way,
it's extremely shocking because 64% of psychological studies don't replicate with humans.
and we'll talk more about that. But yeah, and there is a ChatGPT study that shows you how they can predict whether your study will replicate with humans. And I think that's on the opposite side. Yeah. By the way, this argument that you're making that it was trained on it, even though it didn't use the data from it, is one of the criticisms that was made against recent, I think it was Claude, that came up with deriving mathematical theorems. And they said that, no, they didn't really do it all by themselves because the models that were used had used that information. So this is an ongoing debate. It's not, I just gave you the argument that they give as a defense to that. Yeah.
It also is not humans in general, right? It's the humans that you have data on, which is irrelevant. I mean, it's relevant when you talk about
All humans.
right.
Yes. Absolutely. And that again goes back to the divide issue that I was saying, that
Right.
most of, the traditional joke is that almost everything we know in social psychology is based on Midwest, on college students in Midwest universities in the United States. So
You can replicate that. We don't know.
So here's another one, the demonstration of the potential of AI-based political issue polling. These are the results that are very intriguing because they do find that In many cases, these are making better predictions of who won elections. You can make an argument, they make the argument that that's because virtual participants don't have response fatigue. They're not as vulnerable to social desirability. They're not going to try to give you the answers that you want. However, this is an interesting example that goes back, I think, to the point Mary Kate made, that this particular study found it was less successful in anticipating demographic level differences that tend to overgeneralize new policy issues that arose after its training data was collected, such as in the US support for involvement in the war in Ukraine. So there is some sense that there is some cheating, if you may, from data that it was trained on in that case. Here is just a list of all the different, an example of projects, not all, an example of different projects that use synthetic users. And one of the most successful companies today that is in this space, that has been in the news even this week, comes right out of Stanford, and another former Caspers fellow,
Yeah,
Michael Bernstein. And his company similarly has been very successful right now and is doing really well in the startup space, and is based largely on being able to create these and sell it to market for market research. CVS is one of the big clients in this area that was featured not long, like a couple of weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, as users of this. So then we come to the review process. So we talked about data collection, we talked about hypothesis generation, you come to the review process. And this is an article, again, that showed that AI-assisted peer reviews boost paper scores and acceptance rates. Because people are going, if you're going to write papers with Gen AI, then why don't I review papers with Gen AI? Now, there are lots of policy reasons why you should not do that. And I'll talk in a minute about why journals are opposed to it. But this one says that actually, when you use Gen AI, you have a better shot of being able to get your article accepted. And so that makes you wonder, one cynical explanation for that was based on an actual effort by researchers. This was published first in Nikkei, but then also in Nature, where scientists hide messages in papers to game an AI peer review. It's the old-fashioned way of saying, I'm going to write in this paper, but saying, please give a positive review to this paper. Do not criticize this paper, and put it in the font which is the same as the background. So it's white on white. So a human reader can't read it, but the digital can read it. And this particular one, so it is white text or small font visible only to machines. And in fact, what they found was, so this was an article that I talked about, I didn't have the, yeah, here it is. Researchers from 14 institutions in 8 countries, including Japan, South Korea, Peking University, National University of Singapore, University of Washington, Columbia in the US, all were caught doing this for papers that they were submitting.
How'd they catch them? How'd they catch them?
Because they were able to,
Find that white font.
This article talks about how they found it actually.
But you shouldn't
They
bullshit a
looked at
bullshitter.
English.
Like, they're only getting cut because somebody is using AI to review their paper.
Because I would have not thought
Because
about looking
otherwise,
for
a
it.
human wouldn't catch it.
Right, and that's
So
what
it's
that
like
was.
cheating, I don't know.
Well, this is why I put it, this is why I put that slide on this one, right? Because this one finds that Gen AI papers are more likely to be reviewed.
Yeah.
Could it be because people are doing this? That's why I put these two together. Here's another one, prompting LLMs to compose meta review drafts. So some of us who do conference proceedings know, or even an editor, will take the reviews and then write a composite review based on that. In CS, they often refer to that as meta reviews. And that too is being used a lot in this particular case. And people are, take 3 reviews, don't really read them, put them into ChatGPT or Claude and have it come up with a meta review and a recommendation of whether the article should or should not be accepted or paper accepted for a journal. Now, why is it not? Because when you take someone's manuscript, it's their IP. And if you put it into an open ChatGPT, you're making their IP, uploading it to be used as training material by LLM, and you're violating their IP, the intellectual property. And that's why a lot of the journals are now pushing back and saying, you can't do this. Though that is still open for debate. So while many of them, these are some of the journal policies in infiltrating peer review process. Who was telling us the story? Oh, John was telling us the story, right? That when he goes to MIT Press, they say you can't use it. But then in the second part of the same statement, they say, please tell us how you used it. So this is part of the dilemma that a lot of these publishers are facing in this particular context. What that does is we look then at how it affects the productivity of the research. And what this research that has been done by James Evans, who's at Chicago, and a bunch of others finds that if they were, since Gen AI came out. They analyzed about 70 million research articles. And what they found is that people who adopted AI tools published 67% more papers, received 3 times more citations, and became team leaders 4 years earlier than non-adopters. However, what they also found was that the focus of science was narrowing down. So the volume of articles being published was increasing, but the topics on which they were working with seemed to have been getting much narrower, which is obviously consequential when you want to preserve the diversity in the ecosystem for scientific
What's the
knowledge.
reason for that?
I don't think they can speculate about it, and that is essentially the speculation is that if you're being dictated by a homogenizing effect coming from LLMs, that it is actually putting blinders on what you're going to be focusing on, what topics you're focusing on. And this again is part of the issue where on the one hand you say Gen AIs could challenge you to think differently, to think creatively, et cetera. There are certain ways in which, because of the way it was trained, that it could end up actually serving as unintentional blinders on the focus. That's the speculation that this particular article uses as an explanation for it, but it's mostly an empirical article.
Isn't just like it must bias you to finding out things that we already know.
Or things that are adjacent to what we
Yeah.
already, that's another way to look at it.
Right, so how could you find out something new because it's not trained on the new thing?
Well, it is not necessary that, I'll hold that thought.
Yeah.
There's a slide at the end that Demis Hassabis does that I think captures that issue because it's a fair point, but hold that thought.
But just to connect to your previous slide on hypothesis formation.
Yeah.
The research showed that the AI was able to form quote unquote good
Hypotheses, yes. But those good hypotheses, that's not, that I don't think those are contradictory, Ram, because what it's saying is, if I create a causal graph, the term they use, and it says there's a study that was done on A to B and a study that was done to B to C, and then I'm going to hypothesize that there must be something between A to C or a moderating effect of some variable. Those are all new hypotheses that I'm generating, but it's within the system of A, B, C, and D,
Right.
rather than something outside it. That's the difference that I think that they're trying to look at here. So then the last one here is in this area is research dissemination. This is an area where all of us have pain points. I've had conversations even at Caspus with several folks who go, just let me write the articles. I don't really want to go on media. Some are very good at it and looking at some of our op-ed champions in the room, but a lot of people are not good at it, right? And don't want to do it, don't care about it. They just leave me alone, let me do my own research. So this is an area, or for that matter, to go talk to policymakers, not just to the general public. And this is an area where there's a lot of articles that are focused on how you could be using it to make what you're doing more accessible and actionable by policymakers. This is an article written by one of my colleagues at Northwestern, Nick Teohopoulos. But there are lots of articles that are trying to see how you could use Gen AI or essentially outsource to Gen AI things that we as researchers don't really want to focus on because that's not our main strength. And so this was an article that I mentioned, Nick's article on simulating policy impacts, developing a scenario to evaluate perceived effects. So even before you have a particular intervention, you could say, if you do these interventions, this one is actually something affecting that may be close to what Aaron does, transparency policy of the EU AI Act. And they said, if you make this policy decision, how is it going to have, what kinds of consequences, intended or unintended, it would have in certain consequences, and allows people to think about it from that point of view. These were some other articles that are focused also on how AI enhances perception of science and the public's understanding of science, which of course is a big issue. National Academies of Science and so on spend a lot of time thinking about the communication of science and misinformation and how this could be used. Something interesting here is that simply written GPT summaries facilitated more favorable perceptions of scientists than more completely written human PNAS summaries. Right? Participants comprehended scientific writing better after reading simple GPT summaries compared to complex PNAS summaries. So they also summarized scientific papers in a more detailed and concrete manner after reading GPT summaries compared to PNAS summaries. I think that may say more about the PNAS summaries than about that's just neither here nor there for me. There are also people who are thinking of how to use multimedia generation. We talked, actually, HGen was one of the things that Dan talked about and used as an example of how you can use it to generate video. You can put in your voice, you can put in your likeness, and it'll generate a video that looks very similar to you. And there are many others. Veo is one that actually comes out of Google. Synthesia, Notebook LM is one we've talked about ad nauseum out here, but I'm going to still talk about it even more ad nauseum here. So I took the Caspus, the documents about our bios that we got, and I put that into Caspus. And what I was going to see is if I can show, oh, yes, I need to.
Some ourselves up there.
So what I did was I just asked you to do a lot of summaries and stuff. And this is going to be, this is going to be a little challenging, but let's see if it goes here. So I created different kinds of things from it. So this was one called the Thinkers of Tomorrow. Let's see. So this was a slideshow that could have been used to introduce us.
Imagine getting the world's greatest thinkers all in one place. Well, for over 70 years, one place has done just that. Its legacy is incredible. Get this, 31 of its fellows have won Nobel Prizes. And it's not just science. 25 Pulitzer Prize winners have also walked these halls. Plus, an amazing 52 MacArthur Genius Grant Fellows. Yeah, these folks are brilliant. And now that 71-year tradition of breakthroughs is set to continue. As the leadership there says, this mission is absolutely crucial right now. So let's meet the folks writing that next chapter. So who are they? We're talking about a diverse, global group of thinkers. They'll all come together right here to tackle some of today's toughest problems. So what are they working on? Here's just a little sneak peek. First up, we've got Kenneth Dodge, a returning fellow from Duke University. He's working on population-level mental health and how to support young families. Next, there's Deepa Fernandez. You might know her from NPR's Here and Now. She's writing a memoir telling America's story through voices we don't often hear. And from Georgetown University, say hello to sociologist Corey Fields. He's digging into how we talk about public health. It's about bringing, you gotta wonder.
So that's an example of where when we did that. Another one which I did was, you can also set it up as a conversation, as a podcast. And not only that, but you can actually interrupt the podcast and ask it a question and it'll answer it in real time to you. I'm not going to go into all of those details, but the other thing I did was, can you cluster the scholars into different groupings based on what they're working on? And it was one of those, so you see this here, the Academic Fellows Research Network map. These all took me about a minute or two to do. So this is not, I mean, I wasn't burning the midnight oil to for this presentation. I'm too lazy for that. But if I go back again to, where is there. Oh man, how do I find my, how do I go back to my, there.
What was the prompt, Noshir, that you used?
For the video?
To ask them to sort us by.
Oh, I can show you the thing that I did. It's probably still there somewhere. I basically said, take these people and put them, first I said, cluster them together based on what they have in common. And it said, they put by discipline. I said, no, by what they are focusing on while they are here, the topics they're doing. So then this is what it did. And what I'm going to show you here, this is what it did with our batch. So it just generated this within like a minute and it created a whole network. And it put it, and there's also an audio version of this that's actually a little different from this, but these are the different clusters it came up with, and these are the people it put around there for each of those clusters.
Can you share that with us?
Sure, of course. Yeah, but
Again, it did put all the political scientists together. I'm noticing.
it did put them all together.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it makes sense.
Yeah. So, well, it comes under the democracy, equality, and political economy kind of thing. But again, it's I wanted to show this, and then of course I'm almost done here. The last one I wanted to show you was a conference that was held here at Stanford in the fall, and it was called Agents for Science 2025. Anyone familiar with this conference? It was a conference where everyone, you're familiar with this one, right? All papers were written by AI agents. All papers were reviewed by AI agents. All papers were presented by AI agents. And it was that, so where do we fit into this? It's up to us to decide.
To the beach, everybody else went to the beach.
So, I mean, I would say that if you're really interested in learning a little bit more about this, there's a very good article, in my opinion, now somewhat dated, but not that much, by Chris Bale, who's at Duke, who wrote this article in PNAS called Can Generative AI Improve Social Science? And I think at the time, at least, given how fast moving this area is, it was one of the most definitive reviews that I've seen come out. And then the other one was actually right here at Caspers, where last year they had a workshop called AI Behavioral Science, and Matt Jackson, who had already visited with us once and maybe back again next week, he led this workshop here, and they found a lot. I found this particular article to be extremely helpful because they focus on challenging what we have not done here. And so that's, beg your pardon?
Stephanie Wong was a fellow last year and she was really pulled all these people together.
Oh, really?
For it, yes, so just to give you all
That's
some
good to know.
inspiration. Yeah.
Yes, very good. That's even better connection, yes. Thank you for mentioning that, yeah. And so, I'm going to end by just asking a bunch of these questions about what I think I've shown you mostly is substitution and enlargement. And I presented a version of this at Bocconi last fall. And somebody very gently came to me after a person from Microsoft Research, Neha, she came to me after the talk and she said, you know, this substitution enlargement reconfiguration is an interesting way to look at it, but I didn't see much reconfiguration. And I go, that is true. And so what I did as a task for this particular one was I said, so how does it apply in each of these areas? And I'll end with these slides that just touches on it. If you look at that first stage that we talked about, where are we now? Also, you know, we are trying to do, I'm not in the display mode, so I can't see the title. Oh, I can see it here, but I can't see it there. There we go. So,
I know.
back to,
Yeah, it's it. I know.
oh, that's not it. Okay, we'll just leave it at this, do it from here. So you see that there is so the literature review is all screen abstract. So that's what we do right now, right? We're able to generate search queries, we're able to summarize papers. It's doing the same work that we did, just faster. The reconfigured configuration could be, and I'm open, these are just my speculations, so feel free to tell me, no, it's not really reconfiguration, think harder. Instead of reading faster, AI maps the entire landscape of a field as a knowledge graph. That's something we don't do easily. It takes a lot of time if we can do it. In most cases, people don't do it as a knowledge graph. And it reveals where the gaps are, where two disciplines have been studying the same phenomena without knowing it, or where hidden biases live in the existing literature. So that's the kinds of hypotheses that are not being generated. Ram, to your earlier question. Yes.
Sandy Pentland has a paper on that. I think it just came out.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what he does. He'll be so happy to see that he prophesized this paper.
He prophesized this paper. So he's going to come and visit us in a couple of weeks. I had a chance to
show you.
So
that
yeah,
paper.
his new book is called Shared Wisdom that came out, that Bob Sutton actually promoted on social media. So I had a chance to see him give a talk on Friday evening, actually, at the Computer History Museum. So I will definitely ask him, yeah.
Just back to my question from earlier. So my friend, like some of you saw my friend's James's movie about Afghanistan under the Taliban. And when I was hanging out with him and he was editing it, he said, you know why I made this movie? Because there's no way AI can tell you like what Afghanistan is like under the Taliban, right? So the question is like, where is that line between things that AI can like intuit?
And which it can't.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm still not forgotten it. There is a slide
Yeah.
on that particular topic. So, but you're giving it a great workup now. You're building it up nicely. So I'm here 6 slides from it. Okay, so then the next one is in terms of analysis, we are using it for coding, for content analysis, for statistical modeling, and identifying patterns in large data sets. We're able to do that now. But, and I think this is where the Matt Jackson paper is so helpful. It talks about how you can not only test preform theory, but also use it to create a whole ensemble of experiments all running at the same time with different conditions and being able to redesign certain experiments. It's a brand new way of thinking of it. We never do it that way right now. So to me, that's an interesting new way of thinking about it in that context. Manuscript preparation. We now use it to draft method sections, results, narrative, and so on and so forth, improve prose. What if instead of having static journal articles, we have living documents that update as new evidence accumulates with uncertainty communicated visually rather than buried in the hedged prose? This is currently more visual than practice. No published example yet demonstrates this, but this is where we might end up in this particular case. Peer review, instead of a tired reviewer evaluating a finished paper, an adversarial AI system stress tests the paper's claims against the live literature and generates simulated rebuttals before any human reviewer sees it. And then instead of broadcasting the finding, AI engages individuals in sustained dialogue that durably change resistance beliefs. This is again for those who want to customize how you want to influence different people who think of science from a conspiracy point of view. And then, so the central challenge is we have mostly a substitution enlargement. Enlargement produces more scholarly deskilling and epistemic homogenization of ideas. That's where the narrowing of science. But they make the reconfiguration impossible. The goal is not doing the same research faster, but asking fundamentally different questions and engaging in that in fundamentally reimagined ways. So now to your question. This is the difference. So Dennis Haber, who won the Nobel Prize, he argues that one way in which we can be creative is what he calls interpolation, right? In other words, you give the computer a lot of cats and it'll come up with another cat. That's what interpolation does. And it's gotten good at that. AI has gotten good at that. He also argues that AI has gotten good at extrapolation. That is, you give it a certain set of things and it'll go outside that set and find something. Probably the best example of this is in the game AlphaGo, where the Gen AI came up with a move that no human had come up with so far, called Move 37. And in fact, when it first came up, people go, that's crazy. Why is it suggesting that? There must be a bug in the program. And it turns out that in retrospect, people go, oh my God, that was such a brilliant move. And it completely defeated the human player. This is also possible right now. What you're talking about, I think, is the challenge that still remains. And that is what he calls invention. So he says we have Gen AI is great at interpolation and extrapolation. Invention is where you're going outside the complete scenario, a brand new idea. His argument is, yeah, it can come up with a new move in the game AlphaGo, but can it come up with a new game like AlphaGo? That's moving completely out of the system. My colleague at Northwestern, former dean, Julio Tino, says he's an artist besides being a National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering scholar. And he says, well, one of the things that because he's an artist, he said, I can give you a lot of different paintings and impressionist paintings, and they'll come and generate a new impressionist paintings. And it's so good that sometimes you may not be able to tell. But if I only give it impressionist paintings or Renaissance paintings, would it ever come up with a cubist painting? That's the difference, right? And I think that remains as a challenge.
Well, also new things are just always happening, right?
Exactly.
So time just moves forward.
And AI is not able, those new things, the kinds of things you're describing, is still, to the best of our argument, at least for now, the purview of human invention and human creativity. And that it is hard to believe whether AI is really able to make that leap. Now, I say for now, because there are a lot of people who will go, yeah, just wait, it's going to happen. But at this point, I really don't think, and that I think is an area that still remains where we want to be in this area. So my provocation, AI won't replace social science scholars, but so is social science scholars with AI may replace social science scholars without AI. That, by the way, is a quote from Karim Lakhani, who is at HBS. He didn't talk about social science scholars, but he essentially made the same point in general. Collaborative intelligence is where we need to work with people. If you want to make advances, we need to have both people who know AI and experts in that area, but also domain experts in social sciences. So this is a plea that computer science people can't on their own reinvent social science, which I'm afraid they sometimes try to do, and I try to disabuse them of that. And that we still don't know, but we may only get a paradigm glide if we stick with substitution and enlargement. That if you're really thinking about reconfiguration, that may be what is necessary if you want to really think of a paradigm shift in the way in which we're doing the sciences. Thank you. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is so interesting and good and both a great overview and really provocative and generative. So thank you. So here's what I'm good with you addressing the reconfiguration, but there's something that I feel like is missing that is that's special for us as a place. Here we are brought together around an interest in human behavior. And I don't know whether these are separate categories or the same category, or if you would put it in, at the very beginning, you made this distinction between like AI as a topic versus AI as a process, and that you're going to focus on the process. But I don't think it's really about it as a topic, but I think there's so much to be learned about human behavior from looking at human AI interaction.
Yeah.
And that didn't really come up here.
Mm-hmm.
Also from this notion, like I think what kind of amazes me most about AI is how much of AI is large language models. And I think for a lot of us, pre-large language models, I mean, I don't think anyone would say that language doesn't matter or didn't matter, but it really suggests that language is so much more core to intelligence, thinking, whatever those things that go on in our brains are. And to me, that's also sort of a critical like AI by social science issue. Then I also think there's the sort of all that's, maybe this is the same as human AI interaction, but kind of all that we can learn about humans by what they do when they're on AI, which isn't really about AI as a topic, but it's just like, it's a new window into people in the way that you talked about sort of the computational science. So maybe my final category, again, these are sort of blurry categories, but is about learning, right?
Yeah.
And thinking and the way in which, you know, one of the things that people have been talking about a lot with their students is sort of, you know, AI can help you become a better critical thinker, but it can also help you, it can totally
Atrophy.
mind numb you. So this also seems like these would be the methods for understanding
Yes.
mind numbing versus deepening thinking and stuff like that. So that's kind of my mix of things that
I think all of those are very, very valid issues. And I actually, I didn't touch on the slide. I actually hit that slide from when I did previously. I use my human AI teaming as an example because a lot of what I do is human AI teaming and focusing on how we can use AI to study human AI teams. And I thought it was not important from today's point of view. So you validated that is in fact an area that is important. And I couldn't agree more with you on that. I think it's a very important part of what we are looking at right now, how humans and AI, the dynamics of teams from those cases. And we have lots of interesting findings that I wouldn't have time to talk about now. I think in terms of
not just, I mean, I think the point is that it doesn't just help you understand human AI interactions. By studying human AI interactions, you understand humans better, even if you don't care about AI, you know?
That's true. That is true. And also understand more about human strengths and how humans might react to some of these different situations. I think all of those are absolutely true. I think large language models right now obviously has been the flavor of at least the last couple of years. But for those who are following this route, most of what the next thing is, well, last year was agentic, but this year the big thing is large world models, right? And that is, how do you bring physical models and embodied models into AI so that AI actually knows when things are going to fall off because it understands the physics and understands the mechanics, what happens. And that's going to be very important, especially as we move into more of embodied robotic kinds of models. And Jan LeCun, amongst others, who was formerly from Meta, has been one of the people who has been a big proponent of that. So I think language models is a flavor that is important, but there are clearly other things that are going to follow in that area, such as large world models, which I think also then have strong implications for behavior and social science research in terms of seeing how people would interact. So there was another point I was going to make, but I think that's sort of what my initial, I think that those are very important issues for us to be thinking of in this context for sure. Yeah.
So two things. One is empathy.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I do is like train leaders to be more supportive of or use policy. So I just wonder, is it good that we could use that to deal with empathy, or there are cases of care bots, like people with dementia, and somebody's asking the question 8 times and the AI might be more patient and and not get annoyed when they're saying it again.
So
and then the other issue is ethics, where people use it like to do their homework and they don't know how to code or whatever, so.
Yeah, that brings me back and reminds me also of the last question you asked about the students. And I think that it's clearly a dual effects issue right now, where clearly, there are the ways in which we're using it in some cases lead people to be more curious and provocative. And in other cases, it's just dumbing it down. It's a shortcut, it's a brain rot. These are all these different terms that are being used to describe what happens in terms of stymieing creativity, making us
regression.
Every now and then I'll have someone telling me you're using that, you're going to stop being able to think And it's kind of scary and makes me cringe, but yes, that is certainly and there is empirical data for those kinds of things. I think that in terms of what you're talking about, Ellen, about empathy, etc., there are a lot of examples. I know it's past the hour, so feel free to leave. Those who want to stick around can. Are examples of where people have studied, are there certain things that humans are going to do better, and are there certain things like very often in a team, a human being will not be there's no member on the team who's good at running process dynamics in the team.
Okay.
So is that something that could be outsourced to an AI agent that could help with facilitate and
tool.
say, as a tool to say, we haven't heard from Kate, we haven't heard from so-and-so, how do we bring more people into it? Or, it's time up now, you need to rush and finish, things of that kind. The kind of process things that people, sometimes humans may not be very good at doing, and so AI agents can help with that. Or allowing people to take multiple perspectives in multi-team systems, for example, is another example of that. So there are ways in which people are looking at it in that context, yes.
Just a quick question, maybe I'm very
Try to
new.
give a quick answer and then we'll wrap.
Very new at this. So AI is more than just a field. Like, it seems like in some ways, for me to understand, like, it's a field, not only particular, talk about not accessible. What percentage of people are actually using this, and to the level, of course, here it's very specialized. But it almost seems like it's a particular kind of field. But it is interdisciplinary, like it's feeding to lots of things, but people who really know and can talk about it, it's within the same group. It seems
Yeah,
like.
I think it's my analogy. It's a weak one is there are people who were mechanical engineers who came up with the automobile engine or the steam engine. Okay, so those were people who actually built that on, under the hood, whatever. And then the rest of people who use it for a lot of different things. And so I think our community is one that clearly is trying to understand how those technologies can be used or should be designed, et cetera. And then there are people who do the quote unquote foundational models, which really is a subset mostly of, I would say, computer science and cognitive science.
It's so much harder to access, like, say, a telephone or some kind of technology is more like, this is more specialized.
You think a telephone is more specialized than
No, I'm saying
ChatGPT?
this AI than like the telephone technology.
You think that ChatGPT is more specialized than the telephone? Not maybe behind the scenes, but I think in terms of its usability.
The higher level stuff that you're talking about, the AI.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, that's true. But I don't think we all have to be experts on that to be able to think about how we want to use it in this context. So, okay, so I think we should disband, and then if anyone wants to stick around, I'll stick around.
Thank you.